It was a Tuesday evening, one of those days that neither start nor end with anything remarkable. Work had been the usual slog, and I had driven home in the same predictable traffic. The winter chill was setting in, and Mason was sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, his school supplies scattered around him like confetti. "Dad, look at this one," he said, holding up a crayon drawing of a rocket ship. "It's going to Mars. Cool, right?" "Very cool," I replied, grinning as I set my briefcase down. "But, NASA called. They said next time they want me on the crew." Mason giggled, his laugh as bright as the little twinkle lights Lila had draped over the mantel last weekend. It was these small, ordinary moments that made everything else worthwhile. After dinner, as Mason disappeared upstairs to build yet another Lego masterpiece, I settled into my usual routine. Sorting through the mail was one of those mindless tasks I barely thought about. But that night, my fingers froze halfway through the pile. A plain white envelope, no return address, my name printed neatly on the front. Nothing unusual except there was a weight to it, an odd sense of significance. I opened it, expecting a piece of junk mail or maybe some random promotion. Instead, I found words that stopped me cold. "Your wife had an affair. Mason isn't your son." I read it once, twice, a third time, hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something less devastating. My hands trembled as I held the paper, its corners sharp against my fingertips. The sound of footsteps brought me back. Lila appeared in the doorway, holding 2 steaming mugs. "Tea?" she asked, her voice warm and familiar. I slipped the letter into the pile, face down. Yeah, thanks. You okay?" she asked, narrowing her eyes slightly as she handed me the mug. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I forced a smile. "Long day, that's all." She didn't seem convinced, but she let it go. "Well, Mason's upstairs trying to turn his desk lamp into a spotlight. I told him you'd probably know how to make it work." I nodded, mumbling something about checking on him in a minute, but my mind was somewhere else entirely. As Lila walked back into the kitchen, her hair catching the soft glow of the pendant lights, I felt my chest tighten. I wanted to believe there was some mistake, a cruel prank, a mix-up, but the thought lingered like smoke in a closed room. What if it wasn't? Later, as I tucked Mason into bed, his little hand reached for mine. "Good night, Dad," he said, his voice small and sleepy. "Love you?" "Love you too, buddy." I hesitated, staring at his face, the same face I'd kissed 1,000 times. The freckles, the button nose, the way his hair always stuck up in the back, no matter how many times we brushed it down. My son. Wasn't he? When I finally climbed into bed that night, Lila was already asleep. I stared at the ceiling, the letter's words etched into my mind, their jagged edges cutting deeper with every passing second. "Your wife had an affair. Mason isn't your son." It felt like the beginning of something I wasn't ready for, a crack in the foundation I thought was unbreakable. And yet, I couldn't tear my mind away from one question. Who would want to break it? And why now? Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every time I closed my eyes, the words from the letter burned bright behind my eyelids. By morning, I'd convinced myself it was some kind of mistake, or maybe a cruel prank. But doubt has a way of burrowing deep. Its whispers louder than logic. Breakfast was a blur. Mason was in his usual high spirits, drumming on the table with his spoon, while humming a tune from his favorite cartoon. Lila poured coffee, her movements so familiar they were almost muscle memory. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything felt off. "You're quiet this morning," she said, sliding my mug across the table. "Something on your mind?" "Just work," I lied, taking a sip and avoiding her gaze. The warmth of the coffee did little to soothe the cold knot in my chest. Mason broke the tension, holding up a piece of paper he'd been doodling on. "Dad, look, I made a treasure map. Can we go treasure hunting later?" "Maybe this weekend, buddy," I said, forcing a smile. "Got a lot on my plate today." The disappointment flickered across his face, but only for a moment. "Okay, but you have to promise you'll help me find the biggest treasure ever." "I promise," I said, the words catching in my throat. The day dragged on, my mind trapped in a cycle of questions. What if the letter was true? What if Mason wasn't mine? Each possibility felt more unbearable than the last. That evening, as Lila helped Mason with his homework, I found myself staring at the two of them from the doorway. Mason was leaning over the table, tongue sticking out in concentration as he worked on a math problem. Lila ruffled his hair, laughing softly at his exaggerated groans of frustration. It was such a simple, perfect scene, and yet I couldn't enjoy it. All I could see was the shadow of the letter, creeping into every corner of our lives. "You're staring," Lila said, catching me off guard. "Just taking it all in," I replied, hoping my voice didn't betray me. "You two look pretty focused." She smiled, but her eyes searched mine for a moment longer than I was comfortable with. "You sure you're okay?" "Yeah, fine. Just a lot on my mind," I said, turning away before she could probe further. That night, after everyone was asleep, I found myself in the living room, staring at a photo of Mason on the mantel. It was taken last summer, during our beach vacation. He was grinning from ear to ear, holding up a sandcastle he'd built. Lila had captured the moment perfectly, the sunlight dancing off his hair. I picked up the photo, studying every detail. Did he have my nose? My smile? Or was I just seeing what I wanted to see? My hand hovered over my phone, heart pounding as I typed "at-home DNA test" into the search bar. My breath felt shallow as I read through the descriptions, the simple process laid out in cold, clinical terms. It felt wrong, like a betrayal of the bond I'd always shared with Mason. But the doubt was too loud to ignore. By the time I clicked "order now," my hands were shaking. I set the phone down and buried my face in my hands, guilt washing over me like a tidal wave. What kind of father was I to question this? To question him? But as I climbed back into bed, the thought stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I stared at the ceiling until the first rays of dawn crept through the blinds. The test would take 2 weeks to arrive, 2 weeks of waiting, 2 weeks of pretending everything was fine, 2 weeks of carrying a secret I wasn't sure I could handle. And somehow, I knew those 2 weeks would feel like a lifetime. The results arrived 2 weeks later, neatly packaged in a sterile white envelope. It felt absurd that something so small and unassuming could hold the answer to the question that had consumed me for days. My hands trembled as I held it, the weight far heavier than the paper inside. I didn't open it right away. I placed it on the counter, pacing the length of the kitchen like a caged animal. Outside, Mason was laughing as he raced through the yard, his winter coat flapping behind him like a superhero's cape. I envied his freedom, the innocence of not knowing how fragile the world could be. Lila was upstairs folding laundry. The steady rhythm of her movements drifted faintly through the house, grounding and maddening all at once. I glanced at the envelope again. There was no going back now. Finally, I ripped it open, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure Mason could hear it from outside. My eyes scanned the page, desperate to decipher its cold, clinical language. And there it was. Paternity, 99.99% match. Relief hit me like a tidal wave. My knees buckled and I sank into a chair, clutching the letter as if it might disappear. Mason was mine. He was mine. A laugh escaped me, shaky and raw, followed by tears I hadn't realized I was holding back. "James?" Lila's voice came from the doorway. I froze, the letter still clutched in my hand. She stepped closer, her expression a mixture of concern and confusion. "What's going on?" I couldn't hide it anymore. I handed her the letter without a word. She took it, her brow furrowing as she read. Her face went pale. "Where did this come from?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It showed up in the mail a few weeks ago," I said, my voice hoarse. "No return address, just this." Lila's hands trembled as she set the letter on the table. "James, Her voice cracked and she looked away, tears brimming in her eyes. "I didn't want to involve you in this." My stomach tightened. Involve me in what? She sank into the chair across from me, wringing her hands. "It's Elliot. He's been harassing me on and off for years. I thought ignoring him would make him go away, but I guess..." She trailed off, her gaze dropping to the table. "Elliot? Your ex?" The name felt foreign on my tongue, a relic of a past I'd never given much thought to. "What does he have to do with this?" Lila wiped at her eyes. "He's bitter, angry that I left him. He's always been obsessive. I never thought he'd go this far." My head spun. "So, what? He sent this to try and... what? Break us up?" She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think so. He knows how much Mason means to you, to us. He wanted to hurt us." Anger bubbled in my chest, hot and immediate. "And you didn't think to tell me about this? About him? I didn't want to drag you into it," she said, her voice cracking. "I thought if I ignored him, he'd give up. I didn't want him to have any power over us." "Well, he does now," I snapped, immediately regretting the harshness in my tone. I took a deep breath, trying to rein in my emotions. "Lila, this isn't just about you. This is about our family, our son." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry, James. I didn't mean for this to happen." I reached across the table, taking her hand in mine. It was trembling, cold. "We'll deal with this. Together." She looked up at me, her eyes red and puffy. "You mean that?" "Of course," I said firmly. "But first, I need to talk to him." That evening, after Mason was in bed, I found myself parked outside a small cafe on the edge of town. Lila had given me the address where Elliot worked, her reluctance clear in every word. My pulse hammered as I stepped out of the car, the letter folded neatly in my pocket. Inside, the cafe was dimly lit, the faint hum of indie music playing overhead. I spotted him immediately, Elliot Foster. He was wiping down a table near the back, his posture relaxed, his face smugly confident. I walked straight up to him, my footsteps deliberate. He looked up, a flicker of recognition crossing his face before it settled into a smirk. "Well, if it isn't the happy husband," he drawled, leaning casually on the table. "Come to thank me for the heads up?" I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay calm. "Why'd you send the letter?" He shrugged. "Felt like you deserved to know the truth." "There is no truth," I said evenly, my voice low. "Mason's my son. You knew that." His smirk faltered for a split second before returning. "Doesn't matter. I planted the doubt, didn't I? Made you question her. That's all it takes." My jaw tightened. "You think you've won something here? All you've done is remind me how much I have to lose, and I'm not letting you take that from me." Elliot leaned back, crossing his arms. "You're a fool if you think she's worth it." I stepped closer, lowering my voice to a dangerous whisper. "You stay away from my family. You don't call, you don't write, you don't exist to us. Because if you try something like this again, you'll regret it." He raised his hands in mock surrender, but his eyes glinted with something darker. "Suit yourself, but you'll always wonder, won't you?" I turned and walked out, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a response. The cold night air hit me as I stepped outside, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Elliot was wrong. I didn't wonder, not anymore. But I knew one thing for certain. I would do whatever it took to protect my family from him, and from the shadows he'd tried to cast over our lives. The drive home was quiet except for the faint hum of the engine. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my mind replaying every word of my confrontation with Elliot, the smugness in his voice, the satisfaction he took in sowing doubt. It made my skin crawl. He didn't break us, I told myself. He didn't win. The house was dark when I pulled into the driveway. Inside, Lila was waiting on the couch, wrapped in a blanket. She looked up as I entered, her face pale and anxious. "How'd it go?" she asked softly. I shrugged off my coat and sat down beside her, leaning forward with my elbows on my knees. "He admitted it, sending the letter, everything." Her eyes widened. "What did he say? That he wanted to hurt us? That making me doubt you, doubt Mason, was all it would take?" She covered her mouth with her hand, tears welling up. "James, I'm so sorry." I turned to her, the exhaustion clear in my voice. "Lila, this isn't just about you being sorry. He knew where to hit because you let this go on for too long. Why didn't you tell me about him?" She dropped her gaze, her fingers twisting the edge of the blanket. "I thought I was protecting us, protecting you. I didn't want you to think less of me for the mistakes I made before we met." "Mistakes," I echoed, the word heavy between us. Her voice cracked as she spoke. "I stayed with him longer than I should have. He was controlling, manipulative. When I finally left, I thought that was the end of it. I didn't want to burden you with him." I ran a hand through my hair, leaning back into the couch. The weight of the situation settled deeper into my chest. "Lila, I don't care about your past. I care about the fact that he's been in our present without me knowing." She looked at me, her eyes pleading. "I didn't want him to ruin what we've built, James. I didn't want him to ruin us." I exhaled slowly, the anger melting into something softer. "He didn't. He can't. But we can't keep things like this from each other. If something, or someone, is threatening our family, we face it together. You can't carry it alone." Her lip quivered as she nodded. "You're right. You're absolutely right. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." The next morning, we sat down together at the dining table, a laptop open between us. It was time to put Elliot's interference to rest for good. We drafted a detailed account of his harassment, pulling together every piece of evidence Lila had. Old texts, emails, even notes he'd left on her car years ago. Seeing it all laid out was sobering. This wasn't a man scorned. This was someone who thrived on control and chaos. Lila sighed, running her hands through her hair. "I should have done this years ago." "We're doing it now," I said firmly. "That's what matters." We submitted the report to the local authorities, filing a restraining order to keep Elliot as far from our lives as possible. The officer we spoke to seemed sympathetic, but cautious. "People like this don't always back off easily," he warned us. "But this is a good start." Leaving the station, I felt lighter. It wasn't a complete solution, but it was a step forward. That evening, Mason was in his room, building an elaborate tower of Legos when I knocked on his door. "Hey, buddy," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "Dad, check it out!" He pointed proudly to his creation. It's a castle, but with lasers. Looks awesome, I said, stepping inside. Mind if I hang out for a bit? Sure, he said, handing me a handful of bricks. Help me build the wall. We worked side by side in silence for a while. The simple act of building something together, oddly therapeutic. Finally, I broke the quiet. Mason, you know I love you, right? More than anything. He looked up at me, his little brow furrowing. I know, Dad. Why are you asking? Just wanted to make sure you know, I said, ruffling his hair. You're the best thing that's ever happened to me. His face lit up with a grin. Even better than pancakes? Way better than pancakes, I said with a laugh. As I tucked him into bed later, I lingered a moment longer than usual, watching his chest rise and fall in the soft glow of his nightlight. He was my son. Nothing would ever change that. When I returned to the living room, Lila was waiting for me. She reached out, taking my hand in hers. How's Mason? Perfect, I said, squeezing her hand. He's perfect. She nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. James, I don't deserve you. I shook my head. Don't say that. We're in this together, Lila. We'll get through it. She leaned her head against my shoulder, her voice barely a whisper. Thank you for not giving up on us. I kissed the top of her head, the tension between us finally easing. We're stronger than he thinks, I said. We always have been. In that moment, the doubts and fears that had haunted me for weeks began to fade. The cracks in our foundation were still there, but they weren't enough to break us. We'd rebuild, stronger, together. It's funny how silence can feel so loud. The house was quiet that morning, the kind of quiet that felt earned, like a deep exhale after holding your breath too long. Mason was at school, Lila was in the kitchen with a mug of tea, and I was in the living room staring at a half-empty cup of coffee that had gone cold. I glanced at the photo on the mantel, Mason at the beach last summer, grinning ear to ear as he showed off his sandcastle. That smile had always been my anchor, and now, after everything, it felt like my compass too. He was mine. No letter, no lies, no bitterness could take that away. Lila appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame. You've been sitting there for 20 minutes. What's on your mind? I gestured to the coffee table where the stack of paperwork from the police station sat, just thinking about how close we came to letting him ruin everything. She crossed the room and sat beside me, her hand finding mine. But he didn't. We're still here. I nodded, squeezing her hand. We are, and I'm grateful for that. But I can't stop thinking about what comes next. For us. For Mason. She smiled softly. We move forward, James. Together. Later that day, Mason bounded through the front door, his backpack slung haphazardly over one shoulder. Dad! Mom! Guess what? What's up, buddy? I asked, stepping out from the kitchen where I'd been helping Lila prep dinner. We're making family trees in class, he announced, dropping his bag on the floor. And mine's going to be awesome because I've got the best family ever. Lila and I exchanged a glance, her eyes misty with emotion. That's wonderful, sweetheart, she said, crouching down to his level. Do you need help with it? Nope, I just need pictures, he said, running off toward his room. I'll get them from the photo box. We watched him disappear down the hall, his excitement buzzing through the house like electricity. He's incredible, Lila whispered, her voice catching. Yeah, I said, wrapping an arm around her. He really is. After dinner, Mason insisted we help him assemble the family tree. The three of us sat on the living room floor, surrounded by photos, glue sticks, and construction paper. Mason carefully placed each picture on the tree, narrating every choice with the seriousness of a historian. This one's Grandpa, he said, pointing to a photo of my dad fishing at the lake. He catches the biggest fish. And this one, he said, holding up a picture of me holding him as a baby, goes at the top, because you're the captain, Dad. Captain? I asked with a laugh. Is that what I am? Yep, Mason said matter-of-factly. You're the one who keeps us safe, like a ship captain. Or a pirate, but a nice pirate. Lila smiled, brushing her fingers over the photo. He's not wrong. As Mason continued working, I leaned back against the couch, watching him carefully glue the pieces together. This was what mattered. Not the doubts, not the lies, not the shadows from the past. This. That night, after Mason was tucked into bed, Lila and I sat on the back porch, a blanket wrapped around our shoulders to ward off the winter chill. The stars were bright, scattered across the sky like pieces of a puzzle. You think he'll ever know? She asked quietly, her voice barely audible over the breeze. About Elliot? I asked. She nodded. Maybe one day, I said, when he's older, but not now. Right now, he just needs to know he's loved. She rested her head on my shoulder, exhaling deeply. I'm glad he has you, and I'm glad he has you, I said, kissing her forehead. We've been through a lot, Lila, but we're stronger for it. She smiled, her eyes glinting with unshed tears. Stronger together. In the weeks that followed, the tension in our home eased like a fading storm. Lila and I started attending therapy together, learning how to communicate better, how to rebuild the trust that had been shaken. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. Mason's family tree project was a hit at school. He beamed as he told us about how his teacher had called it the most creative and heartfelt one in the class. I didn't need a teacher to tell me that, though. I already knew. One night, as I tucked Mason into bed, he looked up at me with his wide, curious eyes. "Dad, are you always going to be here? Like, always, always?" I brushed his hair back, smiling. "Always, always. You're stuck with me, kid." He grinned, snuggling into his blanket. "Good, because I like having you as my captain." As I left his room, I paused in the hallway, glancing back at his sleeping form. I didn't have all the answers, and I knew life would throw more challenges our way. But for now, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Peace. The next morning, over breakfast, Mason slid a card across the table. "For you guys," he said shyly. The front read, "Best family ever" in crayon, with little stick figures drawn beneath the words. Inside, he'd written, "Thanks for being my captains." Lila and I both teared up, and Mason giggled. "You're not supposed to cry. It's a happy card." "It is," I said, pulling him into a hug. "The happiest card ever." In that moment, I knew we were okay. We were more than okay. We were a family.